All right, we're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. If you're watching this on our live stream, you're a day early. This is going to be Tuesday's edition. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Tristan Justice. He's the Western correspondent at the Federalist. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at the Federalist. What we're going to talk about today is the impeachment trial that is set to begin in the Senate on Tuesday. Tristan, you were actually in Cheyenne, Wyoming last week. Was that last week?
I think it was 2 weeks ago now.
2 weeks ago. Time, what is it? It's hard to keep track of days and months and years at this point. But Tristan, you sort of were able to take the mood of the public, at least in that neck of the wood, in that area of the country, I should say, when you were up in Cheyenne.
The neck of the plains out there.
Right. So how do you think this impeachment trial is going to play in the country? I think I know how it's going to play here in Washington, D.C., but I'm curious how you think the public is going to react to it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm most curious about in the next week and a half or 2 weeks, however, I think this impeachment trial is expected to go about 2 weeks. I imagine it'll take the full weeks, but a lot of people want it to go a week and a half. Anyway, I'm really curious to see what the ratings are going to be for this impeachment trial, because there's a whole lot more going on in the country than impeachment. We are in the middle of a public health crisis that has exacerbated a lot of other crises with that. And so I remember last year, the impeachment ratings were actually incredibly low, to the Democrats' disappointment, where Americans just worried about other things in their lives. They worried about their day-to-day lives. They worried about how they were gonna raise their children. They just had other things going on than a pointless impeachment that was playing out in Washington that everyone knew the outcome of months before the Senate even had its trial. And so I remember looking at the ratings of the trial of the proceedings last year, and soap operas, Emily, actually had higher ratings than the Democrats' soap opera in Washington. And so I'm really curious to see whether those ratings will be even lower this time, now that they're impeaching a guy who's not even in the White House anymore.
Well, let's talk now about something that you've actually covered recently, and that's not how the public should react, although that's certainly a factor here, but it's actually how you think Republicans in Washington should react to the upcoming impeachment trial. I read an interview that New York Magazine did with Representative Eric Swalwell, who has had an interesting recent history, with Representative Swalwell, where he said, listen, this is personal for members of Congress who may have been in the Capitol, who may have been in the Capitol complex on the day of the riot, and there may be a way to sort of move people towards impeachment, move Washington Republicans towards impeachment by playing on the emotions of that moment. He said, they were sending the same text messages to their family that I was. And it did seem as though there was this appetite for impeachment in the immediate aftermath of that situation and that riot on January 6th that's since maybe petered out a bit on the right. But how do you think Republicans should navigate this situation and this trial that is set to begin on Tuesday?
Well, I think Republicans should treat it no more seriously than the last impeachment last year, because quite frankly, this one is even more deeply unserious, considering that they're impeaching a guy who, again, has already left the White House. The whole point of this impeachment launched by Democrats is to make sure that Donald Trump can't run again, because if he is successfully convicted in the Senate, Trump is not allowed to ever hold public office again. And that would keep him out of the prospects for 2024, because if anyone thinks that Donald Trump can't come back in 2024 and win, hasn't been paying attention to anything in American politics in the last 5 years. And so, unfortunately, this impeachment is going to be even more divisive, because if they are successful, they make a martyr of Donald Trump. They reinforce the convictions of all of his followers, and he does have a grip on the Republican Party, whether Beltway Republicans like to admit it or not. But they reinforce the convictions of his following that Donald Trump is the one-man show fighting against the establishment, and even squishy Republicans who are supporting the impeachment effort are culprits in this establishment hostility to the rest of the country. This idea that the rest of that our Beltway elites are just out of touch with the rest of the country. And so I think proceeding with this impeachment, it's a dangerous thing to do. It's a divisive thing to do. And really, it's a waste of time when so much else, there's even more going on in the country than there was this time last year. And in a lot of ways, I really feel like we're reliving 2020 in a way. We started this year even more divided than we were last year. We started this year with another pointless impeachment. And quite frankly, we're starting a year with an impeachment during a public health crisis. I think last year's impeachment really got in the way of U.S. preparation for the coronavirus pandemic that was brewing overseas, because if people remember at the time, it was this week last year that Donald Trump was acquitted in the Senate of his first impeachment. And it was this time last year that the coronavirus was this bizarre growing virus pandemic that was brewing in China. And the American government, the American people remained pretty distracted from that. I think the federal government just wasn't paying as close attention to the coronavirus overseas as they could have been because of impeachment. And this time, we're really mirroring last year, because this time we have new variants that are becoming dominant strains here in the United States. So this impeachment is distracting from attention to these variants, and it's distracting attention from this vaccination campaign. So this time, so in March of last year, we struggled to increase testing capacity. This year, we're struggling to increase vaccination capacity. And so I can't help but to look at the impeachment proceedings this year and think that we are just reliving 2020 already, and we're only in February.
Well, you raise a good point, because several Republican members of the Senate have reflected on the impeachment trial of 2020 and actually made a very compelling case that it legitimately distracted them from focusing their time, which is obviously, we know, a commodity for members of the Senate and for all of us, really, on it prevented them from focusing sufficient time on the vaccine or on the coronavirus outbreak. And now we're looking at a situation where our economy has been crushed. Plenty of people are out of work. And this is an ongoing crisis in states around the country. People have, so many people have died and will continue to die. And there's a vaccine rollout that is ongoing and presents a number of serious challenges. So, but that's kind of aside the point, right? Like they're going to be forced to sort of respond to the meat of the question. And I'm saying it's aside the point as sort of the devil's advocate perspective here, like whether it's a good use of their time is going to be separate from what they're asked, which is, did Donald Trump commit an impeachable offense? How do you expect that argument to play out? The last impeachment trial, I think, actually was pretty clarifying and interesting when it came to that question of whether the phone call with the Ukrainian prime minister was an impeachable offense. How do you think that will play out this time around?
Well, I think it's a pretty compelling case to make that you can't charge the president with inciting a riot that had begun before the president had been finished speaking. It's hard to make the point that Donald Trump incited a riot that people had already brought tools and resources to launch before the president had even spoke. So the question of whether Trump incited a riot, I think, rose out of this Democratic appetite to achieve the top policy item of their agenda over the last 4 years. There was this great hostility towards the president in the aftermath of the riots in early January, because the people who stormed the Capitol were his supporters. So I think Democrats are capitalizing on that and really weaponizing what happened on that day to implement this progressive purge that goes all the way to the extreme measure of impeachment, to make sure the one man that they despise more than anything else in this country, possibly the world, can't run for office ever again. It's a weak impeachment because, again, people came to the Capitol. I mean, if we call witnesses this week, I would love to hear from the FBI and the Capitol Police testifying how hordes of people came to Washington that week with the intent to riot. And let's remember, that riot started before Donald Trump had finished his remarks. And so to place the blame all on Donald Trump for directly inciting this riot is a very weak case.
So this is something that's important to dig into, because we're going to be forced to confront the question of incitement over the coming weeks. And, I agree that this is sort of a ridiculous conversation to be having, given that Donald Trump is no longer president, and the mechanism of impeachment is clearly intended to remove people from office in situations of constitutional crisis. And so to kind of apply it retroactively. I'm with you on that point. And it will be, if witnesses are called, which is sort of a point that's in question right now, if witnesses are called, there will be a really interesting opportunity for Republicans to lay out exactly what Democrats mean when they throw that loaded term incitement at Donald Trump. And so I think we're about to engage in this long conversation, this extended debate about what constitutes incitement. So Tristan, if you can sort of put yourself in the shoes of Chuck Schumer, how are you going to make that argument?
I'm not sure what I would do about this, Chuck Schumer. It's a hard question, because I really think Democrats have made a huge mistake here. Because if we start impeaching people who are even out of office, let alone in office, if we start impeaching people out of office based on one group's actions, merely citing that individual's rhetoric for their motivation to go riot, we're going to be impeaching a lot of Democrats in office and out of office. I mean, look, Steve Scalise, Louisiana Republican, who's the minority whip in the House, he was shot several years ago by a Bernie Sanders supporter who cited Bernie Sanders saying that Republicans' plan for healthcare was to let everybody die as his reason for going out and shooting at Republicans at a baseball game. And so if we use the Democratic standards of what incitement is, then Bernie Sanders is the next guy to be impeached. And so I think Democrats are really are kind of creating these new, and it's a trend that we've seen this year, by the way. Democrats create new standards in the aftermath of an event, a very sad event, to implement this progressive purge and silence their opposition. They've also done it with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia Republican, last week, by stripping her of committee assignments for the crime of being crazy, and without paying any attention to their own members in the House that have engaged in conspiratorial rhetoric themselves.
Well, I think that's at the heart of this entire conversation, which is that our constitutional mechanisms are being abused and weaponized because we're in this stage where everything, and this happens on the right and on the left, we are sort of conditioned to see things as unprecedented, and we're conditioned to see, the other side as a what's the best word to say this, as kind of this unstoppable assault or unstoppable force of opposition, and they require use of emergency powers, essentially. And that's why, for instance, like the move to immediately impeach Joe Biden, the day that he was inaugurated, I think is indicative. I mean, of course, I think it's ridiculous, but I also think it's indicative of this, which is that we have this we now have this reflex to use emergency mechanisms because we feel perpetually like we exist in a state of emergency, because that's sort of how the other side is, that's sort of how we're conditioned to see the other side.
I think you're absolutely right, and we are cheapening those constitutional mechanisms that are reserved for extreme circumstances. And this was a big argument that Republicans made last year in the first impeachment, saying this impeachment is so ludicrous over Ukraine that they are effectively cheapening impeachment. And that was over an impeachment that had, even though it was still rushed based on past impeachments, had a few weeks of hearings in the House and a few weeks Senate trial that overall became a multi-month process running from October to February. But Republicans warned that rushed impeachment would cheapen the process. Less than a whole year later, after Trump's acquittal, they proved Republicans' points last year by passing an impeachment in 48 hours. The Capitol riot happened on January 6th, and the Wednesday after, Donald Trump was impeached in the House, and now they're moving through with the Senate trial after Trump had already left office. So they passed a snap impeachment, proving Republican points that they've just cheapened the process.
Well, this is another important element of the conversation, which is that we have Democrats in the past 2 years reacting, and not even reacting, actually actively looking for reasons to impeach a very unorthodox president. And as unusual or as overused as the word unprecedented is, it was an unprecedented president in many ways. And they were sort of actively scouring for reasons to impeach him. And that culminated in this 3-year Russian collusion hoax narrative. And what that gets to is something similar as what we're seeing with this impeachment process playing out right now, is that instead of kind of probing the public's appreciation for Donald Trump, a big chunk of the public's appreciation for Donald Trump, 75 million people, they've sort of been mired in this effort to delegitimize Trump instead of deal with the Trump phenomenon. Do you think that's what's happening here again?
I think you're right. And I think a lot of Beltway Republicans are harnessing the current moment to move forward with a purge of Trumpism in the party. I think a lot of Republicans feel emboldened, especially by Liz Cheney keeping her seat as conference chair last week, to pursue this purge of Trumpism. There's a lot of Beltway Republicans who I think were really quiet about their desires to support the Never Trumpers, but never really did. And then now we're seeing these divisions play out in Washington that aren't reflective of the rest of the country. I was in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago for Matt Gaetz's rally in Cheyenne, and hundreds of people still turn out in the state capitol, even though her allies in the press were saying Wyomans don't like it when people out from the outside tell us how to vote. Hundreds of people still went to the Wyoming state capitol and cheered on Matt Gaetz, who is leading the crusade to get rid of Liz Cheney because she supported impeachment. And now Liz Cheney herself feels emboldened by keeping her conference chairmanship to keep going after Trump. She said something to the press this last week or so about how she was not finished going after Trump. And look, they're not after just Trump. They're after Trumpism. They're after Trump's voters. They want to get rid of Trumpism from the rest of the country. And I don't think the rest of the country is really going to follow that. I think we're seeing these people, these anti-Trumpers in Washington who claim to be Republicans, who are cited as Republicans, who are identified by leftist media as Republicans. Many of them haven't even, for years, had already not even ever worked on a Republican campaign in more than a decade, Rick Wilson. But we see Never Trumpers already overrepresented in the media. And I think a lot more of that is going to come out in Washington by these Republican elites who are going to talk about how we need to move the party in a different direction. But I don't think the rest of the electorate is going to follow. I think Trump is far too popular. I think Trumpism is far too popular. And I think it's a miscalculation for these Republican types to try to capitalize on the moment to change the direction of the party, return the party to its old ways. And I think a perfect example of this is just imagining a primary debate stage in 2024, where you have Mitt Romney and Ben Sasse on both ends of the stage. And then you have all the people who embrace that conservative populism that has gripped the party the last 5 years, such as Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and maybe Governor DeSantis of Florida in the center of the stage, who are going for the nomination.
Well, I want to ask specifically about those two sort of factions of the GOP right now, and how you think this impeachment process will impact that divide. Will there be perhaps, I think we saw this last time around with impeachment, there was a backlash in the Republican Party to impeachment that was unifying, actually, with the exception of Mitt Romney. It was sort of unifying against this reflexive emergency use of emergency powers by the Democrats, and this sort of unification with the under this acknowledgement that Democrats are jumping the shark and are in a position with their base where they have to jump the shark, and they have to sort of seize these emergency powers in order to avoid dealing with the country that our elites have hollowed out from coast to coast in communities. So rather than dealing with that, that was kind of, I think, a unifying theme for Republicans, again, with the exception of Mitt Romney and with the exceptions of never Trump Republicans who I should not refer to as Republicans, and who there was pretty much nothing that could unify them with conventional conservatives anymore under any circumstance, and they're probably proud of that. But how do you think, do you think that it's possible a similar thing happens this time around? Do you think Eric Swalwell is right that there will be, it already does seem like it's the case that there will be more Republican support for this impeachment effort? But that can change, right? As the trial starts and as Democrats do what they do, which is, overplaying their hand. Do you think it's possible that impeachment is once again unifying, or will it actually perhaps have the opposite effect this time around because of the 2024 jockeying, because Donald Trump is actually out of office? Do you think this will be where they sort of those two wings further crystallize?
Well, I think the last impeachment was unifying for a number of reasons. One, I think it unified the Republican Party. We saw Republicans in Washington unified on it because there was an election 10 months away. And it was still a very good chance, especially after Trump's State of the Union, that Trump was going to win big, and everyone who supported him and embraced him and his voters were going to win big too. But now I think I think this impeachment has really nothing to do with impeachment, and it all has to do with political circumstance. Because again, they're impeaching a guy who's already out of office. And so I do think there's going to be more Republican support in this impeachment. We've already seen that in the House. The first impeachment actually saw no Republican support, and to the contrary, it saw 2 House Democrats oppose the impeachment measure by Democrats. This time, we actually saw the complete opposite. We saw no Democrats vote for Republicans opposing impeachment, and we actually saw 10 Republicans vote for the Democrats' impeachment. So we're already seeing that. But I think we're seeing that because Republicans, after Trump's loss and after the very sad event in the beginning of January, they feel emboldened to take some type of stand and try to capitalize on an opportunity to lead a new never Trump wing of the party, to try to steer the party into a different direction moving forward in the next few elections. But I also think it's worth pointing out that House Republicans had a great year last year. Where they were projected to actually lose seats in the House, they actually picked up. They flipped 14 for a net gain of 11. No House Republican lost their re-election who was running again, so no Republican incumbents lost. And they were running largely on pro-Trump themes. And so I think it's a big miscalculation. I think it's people who are going to support impeachment to try to rid the party of Trumpism they're looking at where the Republican Party is in Washington is going. And I don't think they're looking at where the Republican Party outside the Beltway is going. And that is a big issue.
Well, so here's another way to get at that same question. How do you think impeachment will impact what you describe as Trumpism, right? So will this be a galvanizing moment for the Trump the Trump loyalists, or the sort of standard bearers of what that ideology is? And that's an entirely different podcast. Actually, that's an entirely different podcast series.
Podcast on that next week.
right. So because it's such a meaty question. But how do you think impeachment? Do you think it'll be galvanizing for some of for those folks and for the Trump first wing of the Republican Party? That's sort of a really crude way to categorize it. I don't know that that's necessarily fair or accurate, but you know what I'm getting at here. Yeah, right. So for that kind of part of the party, or do you think it will force the Republican Party to sort of publicly confront some of the excesses or the mistakes of Trumpism in a way that drags the party in a different direction, however slightly? How do you see this sort of affecting Trump's influence over the GOP?
I actually think it's going to give Trump more influence. I think overreach is a real thing. And I think Democrats are really overreaching here, and it's having the reverse effect that they want it to have. I think if they're successful with this, it's going to make Trump a martyr and reinforce the convictions of all his followers across the country, and many of them in Congress too, who are going to defend the president, that the number one goal of Democrats has nothing to do with helping the country and everything to do with going after Trump. even when Trump's not even in office. And so I think it's only going to empower Trump and his followers and their grip on the party as the true leaders of the counterculture against this establishment elitism that wants to root him out of society, because they're rooting Trump out of society. But I think, Trump, and there's a meme that's actually a pretty good example of this. Trump put out a picture a few months ago, and it's black and white, and he's looking at the camera. He's doing the apprentice finger. He's like pointing right at, and the top text, it says, "They're not going after me. They're going after you." And that's not hard to imagine if you live outside the Beltway, because you're already seeing a widespread social media censorship of Trump supporters. So while Democrats are literally weeding Trump out of society by barring him from ever holding public office again, it's not hard to imagine how they're going after supporters next, because you hear all this rhetoric from elites like Katie Couric saying we need to deprogram Trump's followers. We need to deprogram how 74 million Americans think. And that rhetoric is really illustrative of where the Democratic Party really wants to go. And impeachment is really just the start of that. So I think this overreach, it's real. It's what they're doing. And this overreach is going to have horrible consequences. It's going to divide our country even more. And so it's really ironic that the party of unity is still moving forward with a divisive impeachment that has there it is. That has nothing to do with actual illegal actions and everything to do with politics and simply getting rid of Trump and his supporters.
Right. So if you're watching this live, what I just put up on the screen is the meme that Tristan referenced, which I think actually was tweeted in December of 2019 by the president the first time around. Right. And it sort of brings us to this fundamental question that we're talking about in terms of political expediency, right? So there's the principle of the matter, and there's the principle of the matter, which comes down to whether this was an impeachable offense, whether incitement happened, and whether incitement is an impeachable offense. But what we're really talking about right now is the political expediency of it. And there are some moral questions involved as well, which is whether this is a way for Democrats to continue distracting from their necessary effort to actually engage with the 70 plus million Americans who committed the unthinkable crime on the left of supporting somebody in what they believe is a racist act of voting for Donald Trump. So there's that, of course. But at the same time, there's also this question of whether this is, again, overreach, and you've argued that it is. Why, right? So that's the next question, is why is this overreach for the Democrats? Donald Trump was an unpopular president by plenty of measures. He of course, we know, a divisive figure, whether you believe that's something he did intentionally or otherwise. People have very, very strong opinions about him on either side, and everywhere in between. So why do you think then that impeaching him after an event like what happened at the Capitol, why do you think that constitutes overreach?
I think it constitutes overreach for two reasons. One, I don't think Donald Trump incited anything. I think his actions the 2 months after the election probably fomented some of the rage that we saw overtake the Capitol last month. I don't think Trump was being responsible for when he was rejecting the election results and continued to contest them again and again and again. I don't think it was a responsible thing to do. So I think an argument can be made that he fomented some of the rage that we saw, but I don't think he incited anything, because incitement is a pretty specific term. And when you look at what happened that day, Donald Trump didn't incite anything. In fact, he told his protesters who had gathered that day to protest peacefully. The transcript says he told them to protest peacefully. And the rioters had started rioting before Donald Trump was even done speaking. And the rioters had arrived that day already ready to riot. They were going to attack the Capitol or something, whether Donald Trump told them to or not. So for one, that's the first reason. I don't think Donald Trump really incited anything when you look at the facts of that day. Second of all, I think it's overreach because they're impeaching a guy who's not even in office. Impeachment is for specifically removing someone who is in office for doing something criminal and presents who has engaged in a high crime and misdemeanor that warrants removal from office. Donald Trump is already relaxing Mar-a-Lago. He's playing golf. He's not on social media. He's not president anymore. And so that really just exposes how this impeachment has everything to do with politics, everything to do with retribution, everything to do with Democrats wanting to punish their opponents, and nothing to do with having actually done something illegal.
Something strange has happened over the course of the past month and a half, which is that we went from having the hourly political reactions from Donald Trump on Twitter to having really literally nothing. And a lot of people aren't talking about what that, I mean, we have the sort of a lot of people,
careers.
Right. We have a lot of people in the corporate press sort of breathing their public sigh of relief and spiking the football and talking about how much easier it's made their lives as journalists. But we're now again at another impeachment. And the last impeachment, I would say the president's regular and frequent reactions were a part of that, a real part of that process. They were constant, and he was pushing back, by the minute sometimes. Now he has not been on that platform, of course, and it seems as though he has been much quieter. That could just be the effect of Twitter being gone as a tool. But how do you think Donald Trump himself will react to this trial, and how do you think he should react during this trial?
Well, I don't think Donald Trump is actually off Twitter. I think he is secretly another type of Pierre Delecto, secretly using Twitter to see what's going on. No,
that's a reference to Mitt Romney's extremely embarrassing and childish Twitter handle.
It's amazing. The Pierre Delecto, the disguised Mitt Romney on Twitter was amazing. He even went after Jennifer Rubin, the disguised conservative columnist, Washington Post. No, but look, I think Donald Trump, it's interesting. He gets kicked off Twitter. He can't go on Parler because the rest of our big tech empire banned Parler. How does he communicate with his supporters moving forward? That's an open question. I think Donald Trump could still pick up the phone any day, talk to a reporter, and become national news. It'd splash all across Twitter. So I think Donald Trump could still be a pretty effective communicator to his supporters. I think he's already done that in some areas. I think a lot of reporters, for all the frustration, public frustration that Trump's not on Twitter, I suspect they secretly miss Trump interacting with them on Twitter. I suspect they secretly miss the crazy on Twitter. But how does Trump communicate with his followers moving forward? I'm not quite sure. But I do think Donald Trump is going to be very involved in the political process moving forward. He's already vowed to campaign for House Republicans across the country in 2022. He's already vowed to campaign against Georgia Republican Governor Brian Kemp in 2022. And I really wouldn't be surprised if Democrats fail with this impeachment, that if Donald Trump were to run again in 2024.
Can I actually get your opinion, since we now have the benefit of comparison, on what the real effect of Donald Trump's tweeting was on our politics? And I say that not in a leading way whatsoever. I think this is a huge question to unpack, with potential, arguments on both sides of it. But since we've had this month or so without Trump on Twitter, do you think anything has sort of substantively changed? And what does that tell you about his effect on Twitter, or his effect on our politics through Twitter at all?
I think Donald Trump's social media presence had a greater presence on our rhetoric than our politics. I think on the substance, things have remained largely the same and how we operate from 4 years ago. I think it's interesting that there are some policies that White House staff actually learned through his Twitter account. Omarosa, the former White House staffer who was apparently dragged from the White House when she was finally fired by Chief of Staff Kelly, she learned about the transgender military ban on Twitter and not from the White House. So I think it probably affected White House operations more than anything. But I think it's interesting. I think Donald Trump, I thought I read a study on this somewhere, that Donald Trump's Twitter and his rhetoric had an effect on American rhetoric. And so I hear people say, wrong in different circumstances all the time, or just different Trumpisms that they use. But affecting our politics, I'm not sure social media presence did much more than just Donald Trump did generally.
No, that's interesting. It's kind of a hard thing to. We're still so close to it. It's kind of a hard thing to understand. But it was amazing how news cycles were moved so easily by the. He was really good at changing news cycles and at sort of steering them in certain directions. But at the end of the day, that kind of it sort of makes you realize how useless so much of the daily media chatter is, and how disconnected it is from the larger. The larger narratives that are playing out across the country every single day. Do you think, Tristan, that ultimately witnesses will be called, to sort of return to a more practical question? Do you think that witnesses will ultimately be called, and where to testify? And how do you think, judging based on what we know about who might be called, how do you think that will play out?
Well, first on the Twitter question, you actually made a great point that Trump was a master manipulator of the news cycle. When something was in the news cycle that he didn't really like, he would just tweet something crazy and then it would completely change things. So you're absolutely right. That's one way he changed things. On witnesses, I don't know if witnesses will be called. I know a lot of Republicans are resisting it. I actually happen to think calling witnesses wouldn't be necessarily a bad idea. I think for any trial, we're deserved witnesses to help us make our case. I think witnesses might actually be good for Donald Trump in his case, because I think you could call people from the FBI, you could call people from Capitol Police to testify to people having been prepared and ready to riot in the days even leading up to the riots in early January. I think that's a pretty compelling case. I think it would be helpful. I think Donald Trump could also, in his legal team, could also throw a wrench into the proceedings by, if Democrats are gonna make this, are gonna raise hysterics over this case of theirs, and Republicans could raise hysterics over voting irregularities that I think many of them were still overlooked. I don't think the election was substantively stolen and rigged to the point where Donald Trump lost unfairly just based on voter fraud. I do think the election was unfair based on a whole lot of other things, like big tech censorship, by changing the laws at the last minute. But I still think there are definitely irregularities that could and should be highlighted, and I think Donald Trump's legal team could take an opportunity to highlight those. But no, I don't think witnesses would be a terrible idea, but I think that remains an open question, and I think we'll find that out this week.
So if, as we've heard, there are plans to call witnesses that could speak to alleged voter fraud and the scope of it, you think that would be a wise move? And again, that is not a leading question. I'm generally curious what you think about that.
I think it'd be a great idea, but I'm saying that I will say that with a caveat, in that I have no legal degree. I am 23 years old, and I do more reporting, I guess. I guess it's a better question for legal experts. But in my opinion, as someone who has covered both impeachments at this point and has been covering this for 2 years, I don't think calling witnesses would be a terrible idea.
Yeah, I mean, you can see where there would be a sort of political benefit to elevating that conversation once again, and there's a lot to be talked about, even though the corporate press acts as though there is not, and there seems to be such so little appetite in Congress and in Washington in general to deal with some really, really serious and obvious concerns that should transcend party lines. I don't know whether that's a smart move or not. I tend to believe that these emergency mechanisms, if they are invoked, should be honored. But at the same time, this is not being invoked in good faith. Right. So again, there's there's debate right there too. I want to close, Tristan, by addressing something that has come up a couple of times in this conversation, as I think inevitably it does in these discussions, which is, we can go back to that meme where Trump says, in reality, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you. And you mentioned that the press secretly misses Donald Trump on Twitter. Why does the press secretly miss Donald Trump on Twitter? Well, the answer to that question is because it gives them more ammunition against the millions and millions of people who support Donald Trump, millions of whom, by the way, do so fervently with all of the passion of supporters of Bernie Sanders, with all of the passion of supporters, frankly, of sports teams and other like deeply serious political causes. And so that's why the press, of course, loves they love Twitter, and they certainly probably miss Donald Trump's on Twitter because it was fodder for their argument. But this impeachment is really a confirmation of everything that Donald Trump told people was happening. Right? Like it's another example. Right. And actually, there was a Time magazine story that we've covered on this podcast already, which is about a, quote, well-funded cabal of elites that were laser focused over the course of 2020 on ensuring Donald Trump did not win re-election. And this effort to kind of try to impeach Donald Trump when he's out of office, which I think sounds on its face ridiculous, probably to most people. If you sort of took Donald Trump's name out of the question and said, is it wise to impeach a president when they've already been out of office? Most people would probably be sort of confused by that question, period, because it's a confusing prospect. But again, does this not sort of confirm that meme that in reality, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you?
It really does. I think a lot of reporters probably do miss Trump on Twitter because they wanted something they could use to justify going after not only Trump but his supporters, and so they gave them that ammunition that they craved and sought. And I think impeachment really exposes how it's just the start of Democrats going after the people, after dissidents, the people they disagree with, and that they want to silence and literally punish. After this election, there was a terrifying amount of rhetoric coming from the left, from not fringe leftists, but from people with huge platforms like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, former staffers on the Pete Buttigieg campaign, former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, talking about retribution against Trump supporters, talking about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the federal government to go after Trump supporters, to punish Trump supporters. And so I think impeachment, going after the main guy, their main culprit, is just the start of that. And we're already seeing other avenues take shape, like big tech censorship, that actually wields unprecedented power, like we've never seen over the digital public square and our everyday lives.
Right. And at the end of the day, some people might say the counterpoint might be, listen, this is only about Trump. This is not about Trump supporters. This is about the unique action of Donald Trump to allegedly incite a riot on January 6th. But actually what this is at the end of the day about is what we've discussed right now, that they don't want to deal with they don't want to deal with, they don't know how to deal with, and they have no interest in dealing with the larger sort of Trump phenomenon. It's not just about getting, like they said, he'll be out of office and everything will be back to normal. Things can, start to feel comforting and peaceful to us in our Beltway bubbles as they used to. And that will sort of paper over any of the deep divisions that Trump allegedly inflicted on this country by himself. But actually, what they're doing again is projecting and taking another opportunity to say, like, the primary motivation here is to ensure Donald Trump cannot run for office again. Like, that is the bottom line. The bottom line is that Democrats don't want Donald Trump to run for office again. A lot of Republicans don't want Donald Trump to run for office again. And so that's what the point of this impeachment mechanism is right now in January or February of 2021. That's the point of this, because he's out of office. So the point of this, they may say it's about, taking that moral stand and making that moral stand in the record books and there for everybody to see. But it's about making sure Donald Trump can't run for office again. And what does that do? It makes it much, much harder for them to deal with the reality of why 74, 75 million people went in November of 2020, after 4 years of what they claimed was unprecedented bigotry in the Oval Office and unprecedented X, Y, and Z in the Oval Office. And they voted once again for Donald Trump over a decades-long senator.
Right. And one final thought on this. when you overreach like the Democrats have and alienate those 74 million Americans, you push these Americans into dark corners on the internet to embrace things like QAnon and embrace conspiracies when they've lost all trust in the institutions that have claimed for years to lead them, but have actually failed them and mocked them in the process.
That's a great point, and it's one that we've made in our pages. They are creating more Marjorie Taylor Greenes. They are making Trump more powerful, I think, by silencing him or by trying to continue delegitimizing him, which he's right, is really about delegitimizing his support. So Tristan, a lot of good points today, not a lot of optimistic or happy points today, but
we'll get through it.
Yes. Well, fingers crossed.
And maybe we'll free Britney this year. Maybe that'll be the good thing to come out of 2021. We'll free Britney.
Yes. So that's another topic. We should absolutely cover that. The Free Britney movement. Well, Tristan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is Tristan Justice. He's the Western correspondent at The Federalist. He's who you've been listening to over the course of this past hour. You can follow him on Twitter at Justice Tristan. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channels and subscribe to all of our various social media platforms and to the podcast wherever you download your podcasts. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.